everybody, and welcome back to Talking Behaviour, where I am Charlie, and with me is
James, hello.
and we will be continuing our series of episodes on consequences that affect behaviour, where we will be talking about reinforcement, or consequences that increase behaviour. Specifically, last time we went over the difference between reinforcement, punishment, and extinction, and we then went back over positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go a little bit deeper into the consequences that increase behaviour and why we tend to choose them over the procedures which are more aversive, right? I mean, it seems like that would be a pretty obvious thing, but you actually have to have reasons other than like, it's just unpleasant. But generally this comes down to side effects. So reinforcement is how organisms have developed evolutionarily to understand if they are successful in getting things from the environment, right? So we can talk about this physiologically and say that it's effectively what dopamine does to you, right? Reward,
Right, yeah.
right. Or we can talk about what the overall effect is, which is how behavior analysis approaches this, right? The general idea being that if your behavior is successful, i.e. going to continue your survival for a longer or more likely to increase your chances of survival, you're more likely to do that behavior again because that then will proliferate, right?
Yeah.
So reinforcement can be positive or it can be negative. It can be by getting access to something you want or avoiding some danger or risk or just aversive thing that you don't like.
Yeah.
And we tend to choose these procedures first because they don't really have negative side effects. Well, they have some negative side effects if managed badly, but they have significantly less negative side effects than if you were to try and use an extinction or a punishment procedure, especially if badly managed.
Yeah.
There's also just something from a moral or ethical standpoint where it just seems nicer to be giving and to be kind rather than to be scolding and disciplinary.
But I would also say there is also the line there where you've got to be careful not going too far with your positive reinforcement.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. So what is a reinforcer? Is something that increases behaviour. We talked about that a little bit before. The definition contains within it that the outcome is what makes it reinforcement. If it increases behaviour, it is reinforcement, and therefore, it's kind of a self-fulfilling cycle, right? Which basically means that something that you might not like happening to someone else that increases their behaviour is still reinforcement.
Yeah.
Right? That's a really important thing because people can find things which like the average person wouldn't enjoy, and that can become conditioned to be reinforcing to that person, right?
Yeah.
What you were talking about there is like the problem of like overuse of reinforcement,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
And the problem of overuse of reinforcement comes down to a breakdown of two concepts, which are satiation and deprivation, right? Satiation is when you have something for you get more of something, you will generally want it less, right? The example that I've used before has been the fourth piece of chocolate never tastes as good as the first one. That's because you become satiated on it and it's no longer having quite as good an effect as it used to.
Yeah.
Deprivation, I always use the same thing. I say absence makes the heart grow fonder. It's actually true, right? If you are not around something that you like for a long period of time, its value will increase and you will be more likely to want and go and get it.
Yeah.
Right? This is actually how we manage our preferences, right? Because if you think about it, if we wanted to do everything continuously at the same level, you would only ever choose the best thing, right? And so therefore you would do that thing over and over again to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah.
But when your preferences change because of satiation and deprivation, this means that at certain different points of time you prefer to do different things, which means you're more likely to do a wide variety of things.
Yeah, you're feeling something, feeling like a change.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's very much an organic process, right? And it's very important to view it as an organic process because it's something that evolved. It's not something that was designed, right? So this effect happens with reinforcement. The more that you use something to reinforce a behavior, the less effective as a reinforcer it is for a period of time afterwards, right? So if you overuse one reinforcer, it will no longer be a reinforcer for very long, right? So keeping that varied is very important, and making sure that you have a variety of things that you can offer to someone is very important in the case of like conditioning something, making something seem more positive than we want, but it's also important in terms of the effectiveness of reinforcement, right? You don't want to give something for every good thing because then it will be very difficult for somebody to discriminate what the best thing is.
Yeah.
Right? There is a process called differential reinforcement, right? we as behavior analysts, as people who are behavioral specialists, we want to allocate the highest amount of reinforcement to the best outcome. And if we get a okay outcome, we only want to give some of the reinforcement. If we get nothing, we probably want to provide nothing. Right? You want to make sure that it's very clear that what is expected of the person leads to the thing that they want. Right? This is contingency.
Yeah.
Right? So reinforcement, very important. And there are multiple things that will affect the effectiveness of reinforcement, including things like the schedule of it, which is how often you get the reinforcer, whether that schedule is fixed or variable, right? As in you get it for every time that you do the behavior, or whether you get it every one on average free.
Yeah.
And these different variables will affect how effective the reinforcement is for a specific type of behavior, right?
Yeah.
So a good way of talking about this is a fixed schedule of reinforcement, i.e. you get it for every single time that you do the behavior, is really good for teaching new behavior.
Yeah.
Because every time you do the behavior, you get the thing, and because of that, you know exactly how to get the thing when you want it, right? You just do the behavior over and over again when the actual context comes up, right? This is really, really good, but what happens is if you immediately discontinue the reinforcement, right at the end of that, because the person's acquired the skill and they keep doing the behavior to try and get it, and now they don't get the reinforcement, they go through extinction. So they try a lot more at the beginning, and then it starts going down, right? And they might try a little bit at the end. There's a thing called spontaneous reoccurrence. I talked about that before. But if it's completely ineffective at getting what you wanted, you just stop doing it. Which means that you no longer do that behavior in the right context, which means you've just untaught that skill.
Yeah.
Right? So what you have to do, if you are, actually doing things properly, is you have to move that behavior when it has become mastered off of a fixed schedule onto what we call a variable schedule of reinforcement. So now, every 1 in 3 times you do that response, you get a reinforcement. Right? Or it is put into a whole grouping of skills called a maintenance skill list, right, which is everything that you are already capable of doing, and every 1 to 5 of these skills, when they're run, gets reinforcement, and occasionally that skill pops up and is the one that gets reinforced, right? And therefore it maintains the whole system.
This is like how you would wean somebody off of getting that reinforcement. It's almost like once you've potted, or like teaching a dog to go outside to wee. Every time it goes outside to wee, you give it a treat, and then eventually it's learnt it, and you then
every 1 in 3, every 1 in 5. You get the idea. Systematically fading the reinforcement by going from fixed to variable schedules. Right, that's really good. So the negative effects of reinforcement is kind of what I think we're kind of going to the end of this, right? Which is reinforcement is the least intrusive of these procedures, right? It's the least aversive consequence-based solution, right? But it's not completely without negative effects, because if it's used badly, you can mess up how someone perceives success, right? And it might be, if you overuse reinforcement or get somebody hooked on a high amount of reinforcement that they can't then replicate in other situations, they will struggle inside of those situations that doesn't have that level of density.
So I just slightly different to what you just said, but on your last note, I've heard a story of I think it was goats. It was goats got basically they were family got some goats, and they were teaching the goats to wee basically outside, like sort of wherever it was. I can't remember exactly the story, but goats were weeing, and they would the mum of the family would give them treats when they weed in the place they were meant to be weeing. However, what actually happened is the reinforcement wasn't quite correct, and it turns out the goats didn't make the connection about the treat and the wee, and so they basically grew to constantly want to wee whenever they saw the mum who was giving them the treat, regardless of whether she was giving them the treat or not. They saw the mum and they weed.
Yeah, that's something that can certainly happen. Yeah. It's someone messing up that 3-term contingency, right? It's either that their antecedent, right, the thing that they were presenting as a context was not like obvious enough, right? Like you need to be outside. It doesn't matter whether the mum is present or not. Like whoever is present will reward you if you do it when you're outside, right? And it needs to not occur when you're inside, right? Probably, I would guess what's happening there is people are giving them treats at times where they're not supposed to. and it's overgeneralized that behavior to the point of the person basically just being there. You could also potentially fix that situation by varying the treats that you give, right? Because if you get a general treat for just general behavior, but you get a really good treat for when you're doing the training behavior, right? Doesn't matter if you do some random behavior at that period of time. You'll only get the general treat for that, and you only get the good one for the exact
specific behavior that you're looking for.
Yeah, and controlling that contingency is really important for when you're teaching new behavior, right? You need to make sure that not only does the behavior get reinforced if it is occurring in the right context each time, but you also need to make sure that the person doesn't accidentally get reinforcement for doing it in the wrong context. Otherwise, you might accidentally overgeneralize the situation, and then they are doing it everywhere, which I have seen before as well. So yeah, that is consequences that increase behavior and some of the pitfalls that you can get for that, right? And there are obviously variations of how these procedures are done. There's a whole range of what we call differential reinforcement procedures, which are all about how to effectively allocate reinforcement to improve a behavior or teach a specific type of behavior or avoid a behavior getting reinforced that we don't want. But they're all better options than extinction, and all extinction ones are better options than punishment. So you can kind of see the hierarchy, and yeah, we'll talk about the final end of that pyramid later. Any questions?
No, all good.
Excellent news. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Night.